Hey friend, welcome to Sleepy History Universe. Before we begin tonight's journey into the past, be sure to subscribe and join us for more relaxing history stories, just like this, released every day. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let your imagination drift back to the fascinating world of the 1950s. It may not seem that long ago, but everyday life was filled with habits that would leave most of us completely amazed today. Imagine children disappearing outside from sunrise until dinner without anyone worrying. Doctors casually smoking cigarettes during hospital rounds, families sharing a single telephone, and cars speeding down the highway without seatbelts. These weren't rare sights. They were simply part of ordinary life tonight. We'll step into a decade where patience was a way of life. Neighbors knew one another by name, handwritten letters carried the biggest news, and countless everyday routines that once seemed perfectly normal now feel almost unbelievable. So dim the lights, relax, and let the gentle rhythm of history carry you back to a world that was familiar to millions, yet wonderfully strange through modern eyes. Let's begin our journey into the weird things that were completely normal in the 1950s. Imagine stepping into an ordinary neighborhood in the 1950s, where freshly painted houses lined quiet streets, polished automobiles gleamed in driveways, and families proudly embraced what many believed was the modern way of life. At first glance, everything appeared neat, comfortable, and familiar. Children played outside until sunset. Milk bottles waited on front porches, and every evening seemed to follow a predictable rhythm. Yet beneath that comforting image were countless habits, customs, and everyday experiences that would seem remarkably strange to most people today. Many of the things that were completely ordinary during the 1950s would now raise eyebrows, spark debates, or even be considered unsafe. Traveling back to that decade would feel like entering a world where people viewed health, technology, family life, work, and entertainment through an entirely different lens. The past was not necessarily better or worse in every way, but it was certainly filled with routines that now feel surprisingly unusual. One of the first things that would surprise a modern visitor was how common smoking was almost everywhere. Cigarettes were part of daily life to an extent that is difficult to imagine today. Restaurants, offices, airplanes, buses, trains, hospitals, waiting rooms, movie theaters, and even classrooms for adults often allowed smoking without much concern. Ashtrays sat on nearly every table, desk, and countertop. Guests entering a home might immediately be offered a cigarette alongside a cup of coffee. Television programs regularly featured actors smoking with confidence and sophistication, while advertisements portrayed cigarettes as symbols of success, relaxation, and elegance. Doctors occasionally appeared in advertisements promoting particular brands, something that would be unimaginable today. The health risks of smoking were not yet widely accepted by the general public. So many families simply considered it another normal part of adulthood. Children experienced a level of independence that might astonish many parents today. It was common for young children to spend entire afternoons exploring neighborhoods without adult supervision. They rode bicycles for miles, climbed trees, built forts in empty fields, and wandered through nearby woods until dinner time. Parents rarely carried phones because portable phones did not exist, meaning children simply disappeared for hours with little way of being contacted. This freedom encouraged creativity and confidence, but it also reflected a society with different expectations about safety and risk. School life looked quite different as well. Discipline was often much stricter than modern students experience. Teachers commanded enormous authority, and questioning them was uncommon. In many schools, corporal punishment remained an accepted method of discipline. Students who misbehaved could receive punishment in front of classmates, without parents immediately challenging the school's decision. Respect for teachers was deeply emphasized, and classrooms generally followed rigid routines with little room for informal interaction. Uniform rows of desks, memorization exercises, and quiet obedience defined much of the educational experience. Television itself was still a relatively new wonder. Families often gathered around a single black and white television set every evening because most households owned only one. Rather than watching programs whenever they wished, viewers organized their evenings around broadcast schedules. If someone missed a favorite show, there was usually no convenient way to watch it later. Entire neighborhoods sometimes became quiet during especially popular programs, because nearly everyone was watching the same broadcast at the same time. Television united families in shared experiences, but also limited entertainment choices in ways that younger generations may find difficult to imagine. Household technology was advancing rapidly, yet many everyday tasks remained surprisingly labor-intensive. Washing clothes often required careful planning. Hanging garments outside on clotheslines was common, and ironing occupied many hours each week. Vacuum cleaners were improving, but keeping a house spotless still demanded significant physical effort. Homemakers spent large portions of their days cleaning, cooking from scratch, preserving food, polishing furniture, and maintaining homes without the convenience of modern appliances, like robotic vacuums or microwave ovens. Food preparation reflected a growing fascination with convenience. Frozen dinners became increasingly popular as families embraced the promise of modern living. Brightly colored gelatin salads appeared at countless gatherings, sometimes containing vegetables, seafood, or unusual ingredient combinations that seem surprising today. Canned foods represented progress rather than compromise. Advertisements celebrated instant mixes, powdered products, and processed meals as signs of an efficient household. The excitement surrounding these products reflected optimism about science and industry, rather than concerns about nutrition that would emerge decades later. Driving habits would likely shock modern travelers. Seatbelts were uncommon in many vehicles, and even when available, many people simply ignored them. Child safety seats were virtually non-existent by today's standards. Children frequently rode standing in the front seat, slept across the back window shelf during long trips, or sat on a parent's lap while the car was moving. Safety regulations that are now considered essential had not yet become widespread, and many families viewed these arrangements as perfectly ordinary. Home appliances sometimes contained features that seem surprising today. Refrigerators, washing machines, and other products often highlighted powerful chemicals and industrial materials without much concern about environmental consequences. People praised new inventions because they represented comfort and progress. Few consumers thought about long-term ecological effects, as environmental awareness would only grow significantly in later days. Advertising itself operated under very different standards. Commercials often made bold claims that would face strict scrutiny today. Products promised dramatic improvements with little scientific evidence. Household cleaners, beauty products, medicines, and cigarettes frequently featured persuasive marketing that modern regulations would likely prohibit. Colorful magazine advertisements confidently assured consumers that buying the latest product would transform their lives, reflecting enormous faith in consumer culture. Telephone communication required patience and planning. Most families owned a single telephone connected by a cord, usually placed in a central location within the home. Conversations were shared experiences because anyone nearby could hear both sides of the discussion. Privacy during phone calls was limited. Long-distance calls remained expensive, encouraging families to keep conversations brief. There were no text messages, voicemail, social media notifications, or video calls interrupting daily routines. When someone left the house, they simply became unreachable until returning home. Photography was another entirely different experience. Cameras used film that required careful handling, and every photograph mattered because each roll contained only a limited number of exposures. Families could not immediately review pictures after taking them. Instead, they waited days or weeks for film to be developed before discovering whether photographs had turned out well. Special occasions felt even more significant because every picture represented thoughtful planning rather than endless digital snapshots. Air travel possessed an elegance that modern passengers might find surprising. Flying remained relatively expensive, making it a special event rather than a routine experience. Travelers often dressed in suits, dresses, hats, and polished shoes for flights. Airports welcomed visitors directly to departure gates, without today's extensive security procedures. Family members could accompany travelers almost to the aircraft itself, creating emotional farewells that now exist mostly in old photographs and films. Medical care reflected both impressive advances and significant limitations. Antibiotics had transformed treatment for many infections, creating tremendous optimism about modern medicine. However, many diseases remained poorly understood, and diagnostic technology was far less advanced than today. Doctors relied heavily on experience, observation, and physical examinations rather than sophisticated imaging equipment. Routine health advice sometimes included recommendations that modern science has completely overturned. Neighborhood life centered around strong local communities. People knew their neighbors well and frequently visited without scheduling appointments. Children moved freely between friends' homes, and borrowing household items from nearby families was common. Front porches served as gathering places where conversations continued well into warm evenings. Television eventually encouraged more indoor living, but personal face-to-face interaction still played a much larger role than digital communication ever could. Household roles often followed expectations that now seem surprisingly rigid. Many families assumed that fathers would earn the household income, while mothers managed domestic responsibilities. Although countless women worked both inside and outside the home, popular culture strongly emphasized traditional family roles. Television programs, magazines, and advertisements regularly portrayed idealized households where responsibilities were carefully divided according to widely accepted social expectations. Long before convenience stores stayed open all night, before the internet answered every question within seconds, and before smartphones connected people across the globe, daily life moved at a noticeably slower pace. Waiting was simply part of living, waiting for letters to arrive, waiting for photographs to be developed, waiting for television programs to air, waiting for newspapers to report yesterday's events, and waiting for neighbours to share the latest local gossip. Patience was not considered a special skill because everyone lived at the same pace. Looking back, it seems almost impossible to imagine an entire society functioning without instant communication. Yet millions of people considered it perfectly normal. Many households rarely locked their front doors during the day. In smaller towns especially, Neighbors walked into each other's homes without sending a message first. A quick knock was often enough before entering to borrow sugar, return a baking dish, or simply chat over coffee. Children wandered freely between neighboring houses, sometimes eating lunch wherever they happened to be playing. Communities operated on a level of trust that would surprise many people today. While crime certainly existed, everyday interactions often reflected the belief that neighbors looked after one another. Milk delivery became another ordinary part of the morning routine. Before sunrise, milkmen quietly drove through neighborhoods, leaving fresh bottles of milk outside front doors. Families placed empty glass bottles outside the night before, and those bottles were collected, cleaned, refilled, and reused countless times. There was no need to drive to a supermarket for basic dairy products, because they arrived directly at the doorstep. Similar deliveries included bread, eggs, and even ice, in some places where older refrigeration methods still survived. Speaking of ice, many older families still remembered the days of iceboxes instead of refrigerators. Although electric refrigerators became increasingly common throughout the 1950s, some households were only recently making the transition. Refrigeration itself felt like an incredible luxury compared to earlier generations that relied on blocks of ice to preserve food. It is remarkable to think that grandparents alive during the 1950s could clearly remember life before modern refrigeration transformed the kitchen. Another surprisingly common sight was laundry hanging outdoors almost everywhere. Clotheslines stretched across backyards, filled with freshly washed shirts, dresses, towels, and bed sheets, gently blowing in the wind. Electric dryers existed, but were not yet standard in every household. Many people believed sunlight naturally whitened fabrics and left them smelling fresher than any machine could. Entire neighborhoods often displayed rows of colorful laundry fluttering behind homes, something that has become much less common in many modern cities. People also repaired almost everything they owned. Shoes were taken to cobblers instead of being thrown away. Radios were repaired by specialists rather than replaced. Vacuum cleaners, televisions, clocks, watches, and kitchen appliances were fixed whenever possible. Even children's toys might be carefully repaired several times before parents considered buying replacements. The idea of disposable consumer goods had not yet reached the scale seen today. Owning fewer possessions often meant taking much better care of them. Christmas celebrations looked quite different as well. Many families decorated real evergreen trees that shed needles throughout the holiday season. Handmade decorations remained extremely popular because store-bought ornaments could be expensive. Children created paper chains, popcorn garlands, and colorful crafts at school to decorate the family home. Gift-giving focused less on quantity than many modern celebrations, with children often receiving only a handful of carefully chosen presents that they treasured throughout the year. Birthday parties were similarly modest. Instead of renting entertainment centers or hiring performers, celebrations usually took place at home. Homemade cakes, simple games, balloons, and neighborhood friends provided all the excitement children expected. Parents organized activities themselves, and expensive party decorations were relatively uncommon. The focus remained on spending time together, rather than creating elaborate events. Many families shared only one family car, if they owned one at all. Fathers often drove the vehicle to work, leaving mothers to walk, ride bicycles, or use public transportation during the day. Planning errands required careful scheduling because transportation was not always immediately available. In many communities, children walked significant distances to school regardless of weather conditions. because school buses were less widespread than they are today. Pets experienced a very different lifestyle as well. Dogs often spent entire days outdoors, roaming neighborhoods freely before returning home at mealtime. Cats wandered wherever they pleased with little concern from their owners. Veterinary medicine existed, but routine checkups, specialized diets, and advanced pet treatments were far less common. Pets were certainly loved, but they generally enjoyed much greater freedom than many modern household animals. Television broadcasts did not continue 24 hours a day. Late at night, many stations simply ended programming altogether. After the final shows finished, viewers might see the national anthem followed by a test pattern that remained on the screen until morning broadcasts resumed. Anyone staying awake late enough eventually found nothing at all to watch. The idea of endless streaming entertainment available every hour of every day would have seemed extraordinary. Home telephones also reflected interesting social customs, because the phone usually remained attached to a wall with a long cord. Conversations often took place standing in hallways or sitting near a small telephone table. Teenagers hoping for privacy stretched cords around corners, while parents occasionally reminded them not to spend too much time tying up the family line. If someone expected an important call, they simply stayed home, because missing it could mean waiting another day or longer. Fashion trends created expectations that now seem exhausting. Women frequently curled their hair overnight using rollers, sleeping uncomfortably so they could wake up with carefully styled hair in the morning. Men often visited barbers regularly to maintain short, neat hairstyles, considered appropriate for work and public appearances. Looking polished every day represented social responsibility rather than personal preference. Even grocery shopping involved habits that feel unusual today. Customers sometimes handed shopping lists directly to store clerks, who gathered many items from shelves behind the counter, instead of allowing shoppers to browse freely. Supermarkets gradually introduced self-service shopping, but older methods remained familiar to many families. Packaging also relied much less on colourful marketing, with simple labels and practical designs dominating store shelves. Children frequently performed chores that might surprise modern families. Young boys mowed lawns using heavy push mowers without engines. Girls and boys alike helped wash dishes by hand every evening, polished shoes, swept floors, gathered firewood in some areas, cared for younger siblings, and completed household responsibilities before enjoying free time. Contributing to family life was generally expected, rather than rewarded with money or special privileges. Another curious habit involved saving nearly everything. Glass jars became drinking glasses or storage containers. Tin cans found new life as planters or tool holders. Wrapping paper was carefully folded and reused. Buttons removed from worn. Out clothing was stored in sewing tins for future repairs. Years of economic hardship during earlier decades had taught many adults that throwing useful items away was wasteful, and those lessons remained strong throughout the 1950s. Perhaps one of the strangest differences was how little information people carried with them. Leaving the house meant having no access to news updates, maps, weather forecasts, phone numbers, calendars, or entertainment. If someone became lost while driving, they simply stopped to ask for directions. If they forgot a friend's telephone number, they waited until returning home to look it up. Entire journeys depended on memory, paper maps, and conversations with strangers willing to help. Looking back, these ordinary routines reveal a world that operated according to completely different expectations. Life often demanded more patience, more face-to-face interaction, and greater self-reliance than many people experience today. While modern technology has undoubtedly made countless tasks easier, The everyday habits of the 1950s remind us that each generation creates its own definition of what feels perfectly normal. The strange customs of that era were simply ordinary life to the people who lived through it. Just as many of today's routines may seem equally unbelievable to future generations looking back decades from now. As the sun began to set in the 1950s, neighborhoods transformed in ways that would feel unfamiliar today. Instead of dozens of glowing screens lighting up every home, many families naturally gathered together because there were fewer distractions competing for attention. After dinner, parents might read newspapers, while children completed homework at the kitchen table. Some evenings were spent listening to records, playing card games, or simply talking about the day's events. It sounds almost unbelievable now, but many people regularly spent entire evenings without staring at any kind of screen for hours. Entertainment was something families often created together, rather than something endlessly delivered to them. An everyday sight that has nearly disappeared was the sound of neighborhood children calling for their friends outside, instead of sending messages. A child would simply walk to a friend's house, knock on the door, and ask, "Can he come out and play?" Parents usually knew exactly where their children were, based on which bicycles were parked outside a certain house. There was no need for location sharing or constant updates, because entire communities naturally kept an eye on one another's children. Another unusual habit involved keeping important phone numbers completely memorized. People often knew the telephone numbers of close relatives, workplaces, doctors, neighbors, and local businesses, without needing to write them down. Today, many people struggle to remember even their own family members' numbers because smartphones store everything automatically. During the 1950s, memory played a much greater role in everyday life. Vacations also looked remarkably different. Road trips frequently became adventures filled with unexpected stops, because highways were still expanding across many countries. Families packed sandwiches, homemade lemonade, blankets and board games into the car before setting off. Motels with brightly glowing neon signs lined many highways, offering simple accommodations for travelers. Children often slept in the back seat during long drives without anyone thinking much about it, something that would raise serious safety concerns today. Household repairs required far more creativity than modern convenience allows. If a chair became loose, someone repaired it. If clothing developed a tear, it was carefully sewn instead of thrown away. Socks with holes were darned by hand, and sweaters could last for years because families regularly repaired worn areas. Many adults possessed practical skills that today's consumers rarely need because replacing broken items has become so much easier. Even birthdays revealed different priorities. Instead of expensive electronic gifts, children often treasured simple presents like books, toy trains, dolls, baseball gloves, bicycles, or handmade items created by relatives. A single special toy could become a favorite companion for years rather than being forgotten after only a few weeks. Children learned to value possessions because receiving new ones happened far less frequently. Another strange custom was how people viewed privacy. Curtains were often left open during the day, allowing neighbors to wave while passing by. Front porches acted almost like outdoor living rooms, where families relaxed in the evenings, greeting anyone walking past, rather than hiding inside their homes. Many people actively participated in neighborhood life, creating stronger relationships simply through regular face-to-face contact. Hair salons and barbershops became important social gathering places rather than quick appointments. Customers chatted while waiting, exchanged local news, discussed sports, politics, weather, and community events. These businesses often served as unofficial meeting places where friendships grew naturally over many years. Visiting the barber or beauty salon was just as much about conversation as getting a haircut. Another forgotten part of everyday life was the widespread use of handwritten notes, shopping lists, reminders, birthday cards, thank you letters, invitations, and even simple messages left on kitchen tables were all written by hand. Beautiful handwriting was considered an important skill taught carefully in school. Receiving a handwritten letter in the mail carried emotional significance because someone had invested real time and effort into creating it. One particularly surprising aspect of the decade was how people accepted household noises that have almost disappeared. The ticking of grandfather clocks echoed through living rooms. Mechanical alarm clocks rang loudly each morning. Typewriters clacked during office work. Rotary telephones clicked as each number was dialed. Film projectors hummed during family movie nights. Ceiling fans gently spun overhead, and radios produced a soft crackling sound while stations were adjusted. Homes had their own unique soundtrack created entirely by mechanical devices instead of digital electronics. Many children also experienced responsibilities that modern parents might consider unusually mature. They polished family shoes before church, shoveled snow from sidewalks, helped wash the family car by hand, cleaned windows, painted fences, and even helped preserve fruits and vegetables for winter storage. Learning practical household skills happened naturally because every family member contributed to daily life. Dining out remained a relatively special occasion for many households. Instead of eating at restaurants several times each week, families often reserved restaurant visits for birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, or celebrations. Home-cooked meals dominated everyday life, and recipes were passed down from grandparents through handwritten recipe books stained with years of use. Cooking from scratch required time, but it also brought families together around shared traditions. Even buying a television represented a major family decision. These sets were expensive investments that remained in homes for many years. Neighbors without televisions sometimes gathered in another family's living room to watch important sporting events or popular programs together. Watching television became a shared community experience rather than an individual activity. Another curious habit involved collecting everyday household items for future use. Rubber bands were saved inside kitchen drawers. Buttons filled small tins. Pieces of string were carefully wound into bundles. Brown paper bags were folded neatly for reuse. Glass bottles found second lives, storing nails, screws, spices, or homemade jams. Waste was minimized because many adults remembered earlier decades when replacing even simple items could be difficult or expensive. People also accepted much slower shopping experiences. Checkout lanes relied entirely on human calculation without barcode scanners. Store clerks manually entered prices into cash registers, wrapped purchases in paper, and often carried groceries directly to customers' cars. Shopping required more conversation and patience, creating personal relationships between businesses and regular customers that many modern supermarkets no longer provide. Perhaps the most fascinating difference was how deeply people valued local communities. School events filled auditoriums. Church gatherings attracted entire neighborhoods. Local parades brought families onto sidewalks, and community picnics created opportunities for everyone to meet. Entertainment was not always imported from far away. Often it was created by ordinary people living just down the street. These local connections helped shape identities in ways that social media now attempts to recreate digitally. Looking back today, these customs seem wonderfully strange, because they belonged to a slower, more personal world. People waited instead of expecting instant results, repaired instead of replacing, visited instead of texting, memorized instead of searching, and gathered together. Because there were fewer reasons to remain apart. The 1950s were filled with routines that modern society has almost completely forgotten. Yet those ordinary habits reveal how dramatically everyday life can change within only a few generations. What once felt perfectly ordinary has now become a fascinating glimpse into a world that seems both familiar and incredibly distant at the same time. Even the way people woke up in the morning was very different from today. Instead of reaching for a smartphone to check notifications, news, weather, and social media, many people were greeted by the loud ringing of a mechanical alarm clock sitting on a bedside table. The first sounds of the day were often birds singing outside an open window, the distant whistle of a train, or the newspaper landing on the front porch after being thrown by the neighborhood paper boy. Morning routines followed predictable patterns that rarely changed, creating a sense of order that many families appreciated. Newspapers played a much bigger role than they do today. Entire families often shared a single newspaper, passing different sections from one person to another. Fathers might read national news while mothers looked through recipes or local announcements, and children eagerly searched for comic strips or sports pages. Yesterday's newspaper rarely went to waste. It might later be used to wrap fragile items, line shelves, clean windows, or protect tables during household projects. Zone's surprisingly common sight was people carrying very little when leaving the house. There were no backpacks filled with electronics, chargers, headphones, power banks, or multiple devices. A wallet, house keys, perhaps a handkerchief, and maybe a few coins were usually enough. For an ordinary day without constant digital connections, people felt no need to carry an entire collection of technology wherever they went. Another unusual habit involved how neighbors borrowed items from one another. Instead of immediately purchasing tools used only once, people often knocked on a neighbor's door to borrow a ladder, hammer, sewing machine, lawn mower, or baking pan. Lending household items strengthened friendships and encouraged cooperation throughout the neighborhood. It was perfectly normal to ask for help rather than buying everything yourself. Weather reports were much simpler than today's detailed forecasts. Television meteorologists used basic maps and magnetic weather symbols to explain expected conditions. Radar images were limited. Satellite technology was still developing, and predicting storms accurately remained challenging. People frequently relied on personal observation, watching clouds, wind direction, or animal behavior to guess what the weather might do next. Houseplants became an important part of decorating homes. Living rooms often displayed large ferns, ivy, rubber plants, and flowering plants arranged near sunny windows. Caring for indoor plants became a relaxing hobby, adding natural beauty to homes long before modern interior design trends popularized indoor greenery. Once again, another forgotten custom involved writing checks for everyday purchases. While cash remained common, many families paid bills using handwritten checks carefully balanced in household record books. Keeping financial records required patience and organization because there were no banking apps showing instant balances. Every purchase had to be recorded manually to avoid spending more money than was available. People also viewed household furniture very differently. Dining room tables often served multiple purposes throughout the day. Children completed homework there. Mothers prepared meals. Fathers sorted paperwork. Families played games. And guests gathered for conversations. rather than each family member disappearing into separate rooms with personal devices. Much of daily life naturally centered around shared spaces. Visiting relatives without making plans weeks in advance was perfectly ordinary. Families simply drove over on Sunday afternoons, knocked on the door, and spent several hours talking, drinking coffee, and sharing homemade desserts. These unexpected visits strengthened family relationships and created traditions that many people remember fondly decades later. Photography remained something reserved for meaningful moments. Parents carefully chose when to use valuable film, often saving photographs for birthdays, weddings, graduations, holidays, or family vacations. As a result, each picture carried emotional importance. People smiled naturally because photographs captured genuine memories rather than being repeated dozens of times until everyone looked perfect. Many schools also encourage students to memorize poetry, multiplication tables, historical dates, and speeches. Since information could not be instantly searched online, remembering facts was considered an essential life skill. Students regularly practiced mental arithmetic. Because calculators were not widely available, everyday mathematics happened inside people's heads instead of on electronic devices. Another interesting custom involved neighborhood businesses knowing customers personally. Shopkeepers often greeted regular visitors by name, remembered their usual purchases, and sometimes even allowed trusted customers to pay later if they had temporarily forgotten their wallet. These personal relationships created a level of trust that is much less common in today's large retail stores. Summer evenings often became community events. Families sat outside after dinner because indoor temperatures could become uncomfortably warm without air conditioning. Children chased fireflies across lawns. Teenagers rode bicycles through quiet streets, and adults relaxed in lawn chairs, discussing local news while watching the sunset. Entire neighborhoods remained active long after dinner, simply because pleasant weather encouraged everyone outdoors. Home improvement projects were frequently family activities, rather than professional services. Painting walls, building fences, planting gardens, repairing roofs, and constructing patios often involved relatives, neighbors, and friends, working together over weekends. These shared projects not only saved money, but also strengthened community bonds through cooperation. Another surprisingly normal practice was polishing almost everything. Shoes were regularly polished until they shined. Silverware was cleaned to remove tarnish. Wooden furniture received protective wax, and automobiles were washed and polished by hand almost every weekend. Taking pride in maintaining possessions reflected a broader culture of caring for what one already owned instead of constantly seeking replacements. Perhaps the strangest difference of all was how completely disconnected people became whenever they left home. Going on vacation meant being genuinely unreachable for days or even weeks. Business matters waited until people returned. Friends assumed delayed responses were perfectly normal. Emergencies were communicated through hotel operators, telegrams, or local telephone exchanges, rather than instant messages. Life continued without expecting immediate replies to every conversation. Looking back, these everyday routines reveal a society that depended more heavily on patience, memory, personal relationships, and practical skills than digital convenience. The 1950s may seem filled with strange customs by modern standards, but those habits helped shape a generation that valued community, resourcefulness, and face-to-face interaction. It serves as a fascinating reminder that normal life is constantly changing, and many of today's ordinary routines may one day appear just as wonderfully unusual to future generations looking back on our own time. Another surprisingly ordinary part of life during the 1950s was how much people relied on their own senses instead of technology. If someone wanted to know whether food was still fresh, they often smelled it or examined it closely, rather than checking a digital expiration reminder. Gardeners watched the sky, felt the soil with their hands, and paid attention to birds or insects to judge changing seasons. Mechanics listened carefully to the sound of an engine to identify problems, while experienced homemakers could often tell whether bread or cake was finished baking simply by its smell or the color of the crust. Everyday experience mattered far more than electronic devices. Many people also owned far fewer clothes than modern wardrobes contain. Instead of closets overflowing with dozens of outfits, families carefully selected durable clothing that lasted for years. Shoes were repaired repeatedly, jackets were handed down to younger siblings, and dresses were altered to fit changing sizes. Children often wore their best clothes only on Sundays, holidays, or special occasions, while everyday outfits were expected to survive countless adventures before finally wearing out. A trip to the local cinema felt like a much bigger event than watching a movie today. Families dressed neatly, purchased tickets from a small booth, and settled into large theatres where heavy curtains slowly opened before the film began. Newsreels were sometimes shown before the main feature, allowing audiences to watch recent events from around the world. Since there was no way to pause or rewind the movie, everyone remained focused on the screen from beginning to end. Another forgotten sight was the neighborhood ice cream truck, becoming the most exciting sound of a summer afternoon. Children instantly recognized its cheerful music echoing through the streets. They rushed home to ask parents for a few coins before racing back outside, hoping the truck had not already moved on. For many children, hearing that familiar melody was one of the happiest moments of the day. Without microwave ovens, preparing leftovers required much more patience. Meals were reheated slowly on stovetops or inside conventional ovens, and families simply accepted the extra waiting time. Instant convenience was far less common, encouraging people to plan meals carefully and cook enough food to last several days without expecting everything to be ready within minutes. Another curious habit involved collecting souvenirs from nearly every trip. Families proudly displayed decorative spoons, postcards, small figurines, and travel plates inside glass cabinets. These souvenirs became conversation pieces whenever visitors arrived, allowing families to share stories about vacations and memorable journeys. Unlike today's thousands of digital photographs hidden inside phones, these physical objects remained visible reminders of happy experiences. Many people also believe that nearly every problem could be solved with hard work and determination, whether repairing a broken appliance, growing vegetables during difficult seasons, or saving money for a new home. Persistence was viewed as one of life's greatest virtues. Giving up too quickly was generally discouraged, and children often heard sayings reminding them that patience and effort usually produced good results. Household sounds were completely different from those of today. The rhythmic clicking of knitting needles filled living rooms during quiet evenings. Sewing machines hummed while mothers repaired clothing. Clocks chimed every hour throughout the house. Wooden floors creaked softly with each step, and windows rattled gently during strong winds. These familiar sounds became part of everyday life, creating an atmosphere that modern homes filled with electronic devices rarely experience. Another unusual custom was how people handled boredom during bad weather. Rainy days did not automatically mean hours of television because programming remained limited. Instead, families solved jigsaw puzzles together, played checkers or chess, read novels aloud, worked on craft projects, or simply told stories from earlier generations. Grandparents often entertained children by sharing memories from their own childhoods, passing history from one generation to the next through conversation rather than videos. People also expected household products to last a very long time. A sturdy dining table might remain in the same family for decades. Quality cookware passed from parents to children, and well-built furniture often survived several generations. Buying something meant investing in an item that could remain useful for much of a lifetime, rather than replacing it every few years. Even shopping for toys reflected different values. Many toys required imagination instead of batteries. Building blocks became castles one day and cities the next. Toy soldiers created endless imaginary battles. Dolls inspired make-believe families, while simple wooden trains traveled across living room floors transformed into miniature railways. Children often invented far more of the story themselves because the toys did not provide sounds, lights, or automatic movements. Perhaps one of the most fascinating differences involved the pace of news. Major events spread much more slowly than they do today. Families learned about breaking stories through radio broadcasts, evening television news, or the following morning's newspaper. Without constant notifications interrupting daily life, people generally experienced fewer distractions and spent more time focusing on whatever task was directly in front of them. Neighborhood celebrations also carried a unique charm. Seasonal fairs, community picnics, school concerts, and local parades attracted entire families. These gatherings were among the biggest social events of the year, giving friends and neighbors opportunities to reconnect face to face. There was little concern about taking perfect photographs for social media, because the memories themselves mattered far more than documenting every moment. Another everyday habit that now seems unusual was polishing family silver before important holidays. Special cutlery, serving trays, and decorative pieces gradually developed tarnish over time, requiring careful cleaning before guests arrived. Preparing for celebrations often took days of planning, cleaning, baking, and decorating, making holiday gatherings feel especially meaningful. Children also developed remarkable independence through simple daily routines. Many walked to nearby stores alone, carrying handwritten shopping lists and enough money to purchase bread, milk, or groceries. Shopkeepers knew their families, completed the order, and sometimes chatted with the children before sending them safely home. These small responsibilities gradually built confidence from an early age. Looking back, what makes the 1950s so fascinating is not simply the absence of modern technology, but the completely different mindset that shaped everyday life. People expected delays instead of instant results, accepted imperfections instead of chasing constant upgrades, repaired possessions instead of replacing them, and built communities through daily personal interactions rather than digital connections. The strange habits of the decade remind us that normal life is always changing. Every generation quietly creates customs that seem perfectly ordinary while they are happening, only for future generations to look back with amazement, wondering how anyone could have considered those routines completely normal. There were also countless little routines woven into daily life that most people never questioned because everyone around them did exactly the same thing. One of these was the habit of keeping a small change purse or coin holder close at hand. Since many everyday purchases cost only a few cents, people regularly carried pockets full of coins. Children learned to count pennies, nickels, dimes, and quarters from an early age, and a handful of loose change could buy candy, a comic book, or a cold drink on a hot afternoon. Today, with contactless payments and digital wallets, the constant jingle of coins has become far less common. Another surprisingly normal sight was seeing repairmen make regular visits to homes. Television repairmen, radio technicians, plumbers, electricians, and appliance specialists were familiar faces in many neighborhoods. When something stopped working, people expected someone to fix it rather than immediately replacing it. A broken television might remain in the living room for several days while waiting for replacement parts, and nobody considered that unusual. People also accepted waiting in ways that would test modern patience. If a popular product was sold out, customers simply waited until the next shipment arrived. There was no online ordering, no next day delivery, and certainly no same-day shipping. Sometimes people placed their names on waiting lists for new appliances or automobiles, happily expecting to wait weeks or even months before receiving them. Delayed gratification was simply part of everyday life. Window shopping was another favorite pastime. Families often spent Saturday afternoons strolling through downtown streets, stopping to admire carefully designed shop displays without necessarily buying anything. Department stores competed to create attractive window decorations that encouraged people to dream about future purchases. Simply walking through town and looking at displays became enjoyable entertainment all by itself. Another forgotten custom involved neighborhood sounds that marked the passing of each day. Church bells rang across towns every Sunday morning. Factory whistles signaled the beginning and end of work shifts. School bells echoed through nearby streets, letting everyone know when children were heading home. These familiar sounds acted almost like community clocks, giving neighborhoods a shared rhythm throughout the day. People also kept far more items inside dedicated display cabinets. China sets, crystal glasses, silver serving trays, porcelain figurines, and family heirlooms were proudly arranged behind glass doors. Many of these items were used only during important holidays or when special guests visited. Owning beautiful tableware was considered a sign of pride, even if it spent most of the year carefully protected inside cabinets. Another habit that feels unusual today was regularly polishing family automobiles by hand. A freshly washed and waxed car reflected both sunlight and personal pride. Many fathers spent weekend mornings washing every corner of the family vehicle, while children helped rinse soap or dry the shiny paint with soft cloths. Keeping the family car spotless became something of a weekly tradition. Public manners were often governed by unwritten social rules that everyone seemed to understand. Men frequently removed their hats when entering buildings, stood when greeting women, and offered their seats to elderly passengers on buses or trains. Children were expected to say please and thank you consistently, address adults respectfully, and avoid interrupting conversations. These customs varied from place to place, but they shaped everyday interactions in noticeable ways. Another interesting difference was how much trust people placed in handwritten signs. Small grocery stores, bakeries, and local markets often displayed handwritten price tags or notices in their windows. Customers rarely questioned them because personal relationships between business owners and shoppers created a strong sense of honesty and familiarity. Family photographs also served a very different purpose. Instead of taking hundreds of pictures every month, families carefully arranged printed photographs inside albums that were proudly shared with visitors. Looking through these albums became a favorite activity during family gatherings, with grandparents explaining who each person was and telling stories connected to every image. These albums often became treasured family histories, passed from one generation to another. The rhythm of shopping changed dramatically as evening approached. Most local businesses closed relatively early, and Sundays were especially quiet in many communities. People planned ahead because forgetting an important purchase might mean waiting until the next business day. There was no expectation that every store would remain open late into the night. Children also experienced a level of outdoor adventure that now seems almost unbelievable. Empty lots became baseball fields. Nearby creeks became fishing spots. Abandoned trees became imaginary pirate ships, and ordinary cardboard boxes transformed into castles, spaceships, or race cars. Expensive toys were not always necessary because imagination supplied most of the excitement. A stick could become a sword, a fishing rod, or a walking cane, depending entirely on the story children invented together. Another surprisingly common routine involved preserving food at home. Families canned vegetables, fruits, jams, and pickles during harvest season to ensure supplies lasted through winter. Kitchens filled with rows of neatly labeled glass jars containing peaches, tomatoes, beans, and homemade preserves. These shelves represented months of careful work and provided comfort during colder seasons when fresh produce became harder to find. Even greeting cards carried greater emotional weight. Birthday cards, Christmas cards, anniversary greetings, and thank you notes were carefully selected, signed by hand, and mailed days in advance. Receiving a handwritten card in the mailbox felt genuinely personal because someone had taken the time to choose it, write inside it, and send it through the postal service. Another strange reality was that many homes had only one bathroom, even for larger families. Morning routines required careful coordination as parents and children took turns, getting ready for school and work. Sharing limited space taught patience and cooperation, and families simply accepted this as an ordinary part of daily life. Perhaps one of the most remarkable differences was how strongly people believed in routine itself. Breakfast happened at nearly the same time every morning. Dinner was served at a predictable hour. Laundry was often washed on the same day each week. Grocery shopping followed familiar schedules, and Sunday afternoons frequently revolved around family visits or church gatherings. These repeated patterns created a dependable rhythm that shaped everyday life in quiet but meaningful ways. Looking back, the 1950s seem filled with customs that are both charming and astonishing. It was a decade where people measured time by church bells instead of phone notifications, built friendships through front porch conversations rather than social media, repaired treasured possessions instead of replacing them, and accepted slower living as perfectly natural. These small everyday habits may seem strange from a modern perspective, but together they reveal a world built on patience, routine, and personal connection. They remind us that history is not only found in famous events or important inventions, but also in the ordinary moments that millions of people experienced every single day without ever imagining that future generations would one day find them so fascinating. As the decade continued, another everyday habit that now feels almost unbelievable was how comfortable people were with being completely unreachable. If someone left home for the day, family members simply assumed they would return later. There were no text messages asking, "Where are you?" or "How much longer?" If plans changed unexpectedly, people adapted when they eventually met again. Being unavailable was not considered rude. It was simply part of ordinary life. House keys were also treated differently. In many small towns, some families rarely bothered locking their homes during daylight hours. Children returning from school often knew exactly where a spare key was hidden, perhaps beneath a flower pot or inside a small box near the porch. While this was not true everywhere, it reflected the strong sense of familiarity many neighborhoods enjoyed during the period. Another strange custom involved collecting and saving almost every instruction manual that came with a household appliance. These booklets were carefully stored in drawers because repairing or maintaining an appliance was expected. Owners actually read instructions to understand how their washing machine, refrigerator, or sewing machine worked, hoping to keep it operating for many years. Even the smell of a neighborhood was different from today. During summer evenings, the air often carried the scent of freshly cut grass, backyard barbecue grills, homemade bread cooling on kitchen windowsills, and laundry drying outside on clotheslines. In autumn, neighborhoods smelled of burning leaves and wood smoke from fireplaces. Without heavy traffic everywhere, or large shopping centers dominating every community, everyday life often felt much closer to nature. Mail delivery was another event people genuinely looked forward to. Families checked the mailbox with curiosity, because it might contain a handwritten letter from a distant relative, a postcard from friends on vacation, a birthday card, or a long-awaited package ordered from a catalogue weeks earlier. Receiving personal mail brought real excitement because communication happened far less frequently than it does today. Department store catalogues were almost magical, thick books. Filled with hundreds of products allowed families to browse furniture, clothing, toys, tools, and household goods without leaving home. Children eagerly turned pages before Christmas, imagining which toys they hoped might appear beneath the tree. For many households, these catalogues served as both shopping guides and entertainment. Another forgotten sight was neighborhood children trading collections with one another. Baseball cards, marbles, comic books, stamps, and coins became treasured possessions. Hours could disappear as children compared collections, negotiated trades, and proudly displayed rare finds. These hobbies required patience, careful organization, and genuine face-to-face interaction. People also accepted imperfections much more easily. Family photographs often included someone blinking or looking away, because taking another picture meant using another valuable piece of film. Homemade birthday cakes were not expected to look professionally decorated. Furniture collected scratches over the years, and nobody rushed to replace it because those signs of wear simply reflected a life well lived. The pace of fashion changed more slowly as well. Clothing styles often remained popular for several years rather than changing every season. A well-made coat or suit could stay fashionable long enough to justify the investment. People bought clothing with durability in mind, instead of expecting to replace it frequently. Another curious routine involved keeping emergency supplies in surprisingly simple forms. Flashlights, candles, matches, blankets, and canned food were common household essentials, because temporary power outages occurred more frequently in many areas. Families knew exactly where these items were stored, and children learned how to use them responsibly from a young age. Many families also maintained small vegetable gardens. Even if they lived in suburban neighborhoods, tomatoes, carrots, beans, lettuce, onions, and herbs grew in backyard plots, carefully tended throughout spring and summer. Gardening was not merely a hobby. It helped reduce grocery expenses while providing fresh food for the dinner table. Children often helped water plants or pick ripe vegetables, learning where food actually came from. Another unusual part of everyday life was how much trust people placed in local expertise. Instead of searching online for advice, families asked experienced neighbors how to repair a fence, bake bread, grow roses, or fix a bicycle. Practical knowledge spread through conversations rather than websites, strengthening relationships while preserving valuable skills. Libraries were treated almost like community treasures. Parents encouraged children to borrow books regularly, and many young readers eagerly waited for new arrivals. Since books represented one of the most affordable forms of entertainment, libraries remained busy places where curiosity was rewarded with endless opportunities to learn. Another strange difference involved celebrations themselves. Holiday decorations were often homemade or reused year after year. Families carefully packed ornaments into boxes after Christmas, knowing the very same decorations would appear again the following winter. There was little pressure to purchase entirely new decorations each season. Even birthdays reflected a simpler mindset. Guests focused more on spending time together than capturing perfect photographs. A few snapshots, laughter around the dinner table, homemade desserts, and shared conversations created lasting memories without anyone worrying about documenting every single moment. Perhaps one of the biggest differences was that people expected to know the people around them. Children recognized nearly every family on their street. Adults greeted shopkeepers by name, chatted with the local mail carrier, and often knew the police officer assigned to their neighborhood. Daily life felt more personal because communities were built through repeated face-to-face encounters rather than online interactions. Looking back today, these ordinary habits reveal just how dramatically everyday life has changed within only a few generations. The people of the 1950s lived without smartphones, internet searches, streaming services, GPS navigation, online shopping, or social media. Yet they built lives filled with routines that felt perfectly complete to them. They relied on patience instead of speed, conversations instead of notifications, craftsmanship instead of convenience, and community instead of constant connectivity. What now seems wonderfully strange was once simply another ordinary day, reminding us that every generation quietly creates its own version of normal, never realizing that future generations will one day look back in amazement at the simplest parts of everyday life. One of the most fascinating things about the 1950s was how ordinary people accepted routines that required far more effort than we would tolerate today. Even something as simple as listening to music demanded planning. Families carefully built collections of vinyl records, placing each one gently onto a record player before lowering the needle by hand. If someone wanted to hear a favorite song again, they had to physically lift the needle and return it to the beginning. There were no playlists, no shuffle buttons, and no instant access to millions of songs. Every listening session became a small event that encouraged people to appreciate the music instead of letting it fade into the background. Another everyday habit that seems strange now was the importance of polishing shoes. Before leaving for work, school, church, or important social events, many people spent time applying polish, brushing leather until it shined, and carefully wiping away every mark. A well-polished pair of shoes reflected pride, discipline, and respectability. Parents often taught children how to care for their shoes at an early age, expecting them to maintain their appearance without being reminded. The local post office also played a much larger role in everyday life. Beyond delivering letters, it handled money orders, parcels, official documents, and long-distance communication. Visiting the post office was part of many weekly routines, and employees often recognized customers by name. It served as one of the community's most reliable institutions, connecting families separated by hundreds or even thousands of miles. Another forgotten custom involved borrowing books, magazines, and even recipes from neighbors. Instead of buying every new publication, friends exchanged reading materials after finishing them. A popular novel might pass through several households before finally returning to its original owner. This sharing culture saved money while giving neighbors another reason to visit one another regularly. Children also developed hobbies that required remarkable patience. Building detailed model airplanes, assembling miniature trains, collecting coins from different countries, or carefully arranging stamp collections could occupy countless hours. These hobbies rewarded concentration and persistence rather than quick results, teaching valuable lessons that extended far beyond simple entertainment. Another curious sight during the decade was the neighborhood tailor or dressmaker. Rather than purchasing every piece of clothing many families had garments adjusted to fit perfectly. Dresses were shortened, jackets altered, trousers repaired, and children's clothing modified as they grew taller. Well, made clothing was expected to last, making these skilled professionals an important part of everyday community life. Window fans became another symbol of summer. Before central air conditioning became common, families placed large electric fans in open windows to draw cooler evening air into the house. Throughout warm nights, the steady humming of these fans became a familiar soundtrack as curtains gently moved in the breeze. Sleeping with windows open felt perfectly normal in many neighborhoods where traffic remained light and evenings stayed quiet. Another unusual habit involved carefully maintaining household calendars. Important birthdays, anniversaries, appointments, and community events were written by hand on paper calendars hanging in kitchens. These calendars often included notes about school activities, church meetings, grocery reminders, or upcoming family visits. There were no automatic reminders, so remembering important dates depended entirely on good organization. Even grocery shopping reflected different priorities. Seasonal foods were eagerly anticipated because many fruits and vegetables were unavailable during certain months. The arrival of fresh strawberries, sweet corn, peaches, or pumpkins became small annual celebrations. Families naturally adjusted their meals according to the changing seasons, instead of expecting every ingredient to be available year-round. Many neighborhoods also supported local bakeries, where fresh bread was baked every morning. The smell of warm bread drifting through nearby streets became part of daily life. Customers often purchased bread the same day it was baked because preservatives were less common than they are today. Stale bread rarely went to waste, instead becoming breadcrumbs, stuffing, or bread pudding. Another strange custom by modern standards was how carefully people maintained family traditions. Holiday recipes, birthday customs, Sunday routines, and annual vacations remained remarkably consistent from year to year. Children grew up expecting certain meals, decorations, games, and celebrations because families found comfort in repeating familiar traditions across generations. People also viewed waiting rooms differently. Whether visiting a doctor, barber, or dentist, waiting quietly while reading magazines was considered perfectly normal. There was no scrolling through phones or wearing headphones. Complete strangers often began conversations simply because they happened to be sitting beside one another, making waiting feel surprisingly social. Another fascinating difference involved the pace of learning new skills. If someone wanted to learn woodworking, knitting, gardening, photography, or cooking, they often relied on books, experienced relatives, or community classes. Progress happened gradually through practice and observation rather than short online tutorials. Mastering a craft frequently took years, making the achievement feel especially rewarding. Neighborhood evenings carried their own unmistakable rhythm. Porch lights gradually illuminated one house after another as daylight faded. Children reluctantly headed home after hearing parents call their names across the street. Lawn sprinklers clicked steadily across freshly cut grass, while the distant sound of crickets filled the air. Families closed windows as temperatures dropped, and quiet settled naturally over the neighborhood without the constant noise of traffic or electronic devices. Perhaps the most surprising thing about the 1950s was that many people rarely thought their lives were unusual at all. They did not realize they were living during a period that future generations would study with curiosity. The routines that now seem charming or strange, repairing instead of replacing, writing letters instead of sending messages, gathering around a single television, memorizing phone numbers, sharing tools with neighbors, and waiting patiently for everyday conveniences, simply formed the ordinary background of daily life. Looking back from the modern world, it becomes clear that the greatest difference was not any single invention or custom, but the overall pace at which life unfolded. Days moved more slowly. Conversations lasted longer, possessions were treasured more carefully, and communities depended more heavily on one another. The people of the 1950s built meaningful lives without many of the conveniences we now take for granted, proving that what feels perfectly normal in one generation can become wonderfully fascinating in the next. Their everyday world reminds us that history is often found not in extraordinary events, but in the quiet routines that millions of ordinary people repeated day after day, never imagining that one day those very habits would seem so remarkably different. As another ordinary morning unfolded somewhere in the 1950s, countless little habits quietly shaped the day in ways that would surprise modern observers. The kitchen radio played soft music while breakfast was prepared. Children packed school books without electronic devices, and parents glanced at wall clocks rather than smartwatches before heading out the door. Every task seemed to involve a little more time, a little more patience, and a little more human effort. Yet because everyone lived that way, nobody felt they were missing anything. One surprisingly normal practice was saving wrapping paper, ribbons, and gift boxes after birthdays or holidays. Instead of tearing open presents and throwing everything away, many families carefully untied bows, folded wrapping paper, and stored gift bags for future celebrations. Even decorative string was sometimes rolled up and kept in drawers, because it might prove useful another day. Wastefulness was discouraged, and finding another purpose for everyday objects became almost second nature. Another curious sight was the family sewing basket. Nearly every household seemed to have one filled with needles, thread in many different colours, scissors, measuring tape, spare buttons, and pieces of fabric saved from old clothing. Whenever a shirt lost a button or trousers developed a small tear, someone in the family usually repaired them that very evening. Throwing away perfectly good clothing because of a tiny hole simply seemed unnecessary. People also approached household cleaning very differently. Entire Saturdays were often dedicated to cleaning every room thoroughly. Rugs were taken outside and beaten to remove dust. Furniture was polished by hand, windows were washed carefully, and wooden floors received fresh wax until they gleamed. It required hours of work, but families took genuine pride in maintaining spotless homes. Another forgotten custom involved children's birthday invitations. Instead of electronic messages, invitations were handwritten or personally delivered to friends' homes. Children often rode bicycles around the neighborhood, dropping invitations into mailboxes or handing them directly to classmates after school. Accepting an invitation usually meant promising in person that you would attend. Rainy days also felt different because they naturally slowed life down. Families stayed indoors playing board games, reading books aloud, baking desserts, or simply watching raindrops race down the windows. Since there were fewer entertainment options, people often became surprisingly creative with whatever was already available around the house. Another everyday routine involved sharpening pencils with small, handheld sharpeners or wall-mounted pencil sharpeners at school. Students carefully collected shavings in small containers or waste baskets before returning to neat rows of desks to continue writing. The simple act of sharpening a pencil became an ordinary part of every school day. Many people also kept handwritten address books filled with names, birthdays, telephone numbers, and mailing addresses. Whenever someone moved to a new house or changed telephone numbers, the information had to be carefully updated by hand. These little books often remained in families for decades, becoming valuable records of friendships and family connections. Another strange habit by today's standards was the excitement surrounding ordinary household deliveries. Whether it was a new washing machine, refrigerator, sewing machine, or piece of furniture, the arrival of a delivery truck often attracted curious neighbors eager to admire the latest purchase. Major household appliances represented significant investments that families expected to use for many years. Children also spent remarkable amounts of time simply observing the world around them. They watched ants build colonies, searched for unusual birds, skipped stones across ponds, climbed hills just to enjoy the view, and collected colorful autumn leaves. Without endless digital entertainment competing for attention, nature itself became one of the greatest sources of curiosity and adventure. Even simple desserts reflected a slower lifestyle. Homemade pies cooled on kitchen windowsills, cookies baked in large batches filled tins that lasted throughout the week, and homemade ice cream required hand-cranked machines during family gatherings. Preparing treats often became a shared activity rather than a quick trip to the supermarket freezer. Another fascinating difference was how seriously people treated handwritten correspondence. Thank you letters after receiving gifts, sympathy cards during difficult times, congratulation notes for graduations, and letters to relatives were all considered signs of good manners. Beautiful handwriting was admired because every carefully written letter reflected the effort and thoughtfulness of its sender. Many fathers also kept garages or small workshops filled with carefully organized tools. Weekends often involved repairing bicycles, building shelves, fixing lawn furniture, or creating handmade toys for children. These projects were rarely rushed. Instead, they provided quiet satisfaction that came from making or repairing something with one's own hands. Another forgotten custom involved polishing family silver or special dinnerware before holidays. Children sometimes helped by carefully wiping each spoon or serving tray while listening to stories about previous family celebrations. Preparing for important occasions became a tradition in itself, strengthening connections between generations. Perhaps most remarkable was how naturally people accepted waiting for relatives to arrive by train, waiting for letters to cross the country, waiting for favorite television programs to air, waiting for film to be developed, waiting for gardens to grow, and waiting for homemade bread to rise. Waiting was simply woven into everyday life, and people rarely expected the world to move any faster than it naturally could. As the evening came to an end, Families often gathered one last time before bedtime. Parents checked that doors were locked. Children prepared school clothes for the following morning, and lights gradually disappeared one room at a time until neighborhoods grew quiet beneath the stars. There were no glowing phone screens, lighting bedrooms late into the night. No endless stream of notifications interrupting sleep, and no pressure to remain constantly connected. Tomorrow would bring another ordinary day following many of the same comforting routines. Looking back now, these everyday moments reveal why the 1950s continue to fascinate people decades later. It was not only the fashion, music, or classic automobiles that made the era unique, but the countless small habits that quietly shaped ordinary lives. The decade reminds us that history is often hidden inside simple routines. Writing letters by hand, fixing broken toys, sharing conversations on front porches, baking from family recipes, waiting patiently for good things, and finding happiness in everyday moments. Those customs may seem wonderfully strange today, but they formed the heartbeat of a generation that lived at a pace almost impossible to imagine in the modern world. Even bedtime followed traditions that feel surprisingly unusual today. Long before most homes had multiple televisions or personal electronic devices, families naturally began winding down together as the evening grew late. Children brushed their teeth, changed into pajamas, and listened to bedtime stories read by parents or grandparents. Instead of falling asleep with videos playing in the background, many drifted off while hearing the distant sound of crickets outside an open window or the soft ticking of a clock somewhere in the hallway. Bedrooms were quiet places designed almost entirely for sleeping rather than entertainment. Another forgotten part of everyday life was the importance of neighborhood gossip. Without social media or community websites, local news spread through conversations. A new family moving onto the street, someone's recent engagement, the opening of a new store, or plans for the annual town fair often became topics discussed over backyard fences at barber shops, or while waiting in line at the grocery store. News traveled surprisingly quickly despite the lack of modern technology, because people spoke with one another. So often, many households also kept emergency candles in kitchen drawers, because temporary power outages were accepted as an occasional inconvenience. When electricity failed, families simply lit candles or oil lamps, gathered together in one room, and continued talking, reading, or playing simple games until the lights returned. Children often found these evenings exciting rather than frustrating, because the entire house suddenly felt transformed. Another habit that now seems almost impossible was how many people navigated unfamiliar places without detailed directions. Visiting a new town often involved stopping several times to ask local residents for guidance. Gas station attendants, shopkeepers, police officers, and even pedestrians willingly explained routes using landmarks instead of street. By street navigation. Turn left at the old church or keep driving until you see the red barn were perfectly normal directions that people remembered with surprising accuracy. Shopping for school supplies also looked very different. At the beginning of each school year, children received simple notebooks, wooden pencils, rulers, crayons, and perhaps a sturdy lunchbox decorated with a favorite television character. These supplies were expected to last for many months, and students took care not to lose them because replacing them frequently was not always practical. Another ordinary sight was families keeping small home medicine cabinets stocked with familiar remedies that had been used for years. Minor colds were often treated with warm soup, plenty of rest, and homemade remedies passed down through generations. Grandparents confidently recommended traditional treatments they had learned from their own parents, blending family experience with the medical knowledge available at the time. People also spent far more time outdoors, simply because their homes naturally encouraged it. Front porches became evening gathering places where neighbors exchanged greetings as they walked by. Children played until porch lights flickered on, signaling that it was finally time to head inside. During pleasant weather, conversations often continued outdoors, long after the sun had disappeared below the horizon. Another fascinating custom involved neighborhood watchfulness that happened naturally rather than through organized programs. Adults sitting on porches noticed unfamiliar vehicles, helped children who fell from bicycles, returned lost pets, and quietly kept an eye on one another's homes whenever someone traveled. This informal network of caring neighbors created a strong sense of security in many communities. Many people also saved greeting cards and handwritten letters inside boxes or drawers for decades. These personal messages became treasured keepsakes that families reread during holidays or after loved ones had passed away. Long before digital photographs and cloud storage, these handwritten memories preserved family history in deeply personal ways. Another strange habit, by today's standards, was how little advertising interrupted daily life compared to now. While advertisements certainly existed on television, radio, newspapers, and billboards, people were not constantly surrounded by personalized marketing following them from one device to another. Shopping decisions were often influenced more by recommendations from neighbors or personal experience than by endless online promotions. Community events also attracted remarkable participation. School plays filled auditoriums with proud parents and grandparents. County fairs displayed homemade quilts, baked goods, vegetables, and livestock, raised by local families. Holiday parades brought entire neighborhoods onto sidewalks, waving at familiar faces. These gatherings strengthened community identity in ways that extended far beyond simple entertainment. Another forgotten tradition involved carefully maintaining family recipe collections. Favorite recipes were copied by hand onto index cards or written inside notebooks that gradually filled with stains from years of use. Mothers, grandmothers, aunts, and neighbors exchanged recipes during visits, preserving family traditions one handwritten page at a time. These recipe books often became treasured heirlooms passed from one generation to the next. Perhaps one of the greatest differences was the way people experienced time itself. Sundays felt genuinely different from weekdays. Summer vacations seemed endless to children because every day unfolded slowly. Holidays arrived after weeks of anticipation rather than being surrounded by constant online reminders months in advance. Without endless notifications dividing attention into tiny fragments, people often experienced each moment more completely. Looking back, it becomes clear that many of the strangest things about the 1950s were not dramatic or shocking, but wonderfully ordinary. It was a world where handwritten letters carried heartfelt emotions across great distances, where children recognized every family on their street, where broken belongings were patiently repaired instead of replaced, where neighbors borrowed cups of sugar without hesitation, and where evenings often ended with quiet conversations instead of glowing screens. These everyday customs created a rhythm of life that now feels both distant and strangely comforting. They remind us that every generation believes its own way of living is perfectly normal, never realizing that decades later, future generations will look back with curiosity, wondering how such simple routines once shaped the daily lives of millions of people. As the years passed, There were countless other everyday habits that people barely noticed because they had become so deeply woven into ordinary life. For example, many homes had only one family telephone and everyone learned to share it. If a teenager spent too long talking with a friend, other family members simply waited their turn. There was no private phone tucked away in every bedroom, and certainly no personal device carried in a pocket. Conversations naturally became shorter because everyone understood that someone else might need to make a call. Another surprisingly normal custom was repairing children's toys instead of replacing them. A loose wheel on a toy truck, a broken doll arm, or a damaged teddy bear was usually fixed with glue, thread, or a few simple tools. Parents often believed that caring for belongings taught responsibility, and children became attached to toys that remained with them for many years, instead of being replaced every birthday. People also thought differently about photographs. Cameras were usually brought out only for important occasions, so ordinary weekdays often passed without a single picture being taken. Families lived through birthdays, vacations, and celebrations without feeling the need to document every moment. Many treasured memories existed only in people's minds, passed down through stories rather than endless collections of digital images. Another everyday sight was handwritten signs taped to community bulletin boards. Grocery stores, libraries, churches, and town halls displayed announcements for bake sales, school concerts, local dances, charity events, and neighborhood meetings. These simple notice boards served as the community's social network, quietly connecting people long before the internet existed. Many people also carried pocket handkerchiefs almost everywhere they went. Men kept neatly folded cloth handkerchiefs in jacket pockets, while women often carried embroidered versions inside handbags. These reusable cloths were considered practical everyday items and reflected a time before disposable tissues became common in every pocket and purse. Another forgotten routine involved polishing furniture with scented wax. Wooden tables, cabinets, and chairs were carefully cleaned and polished until they developed a rich shine. The smell of furniture polish became part of the atmosphere in many homes, especially before holidays or family gatherings, when every room received extra attention. Children often spent entire afternoons creating homemade entertainment. They built puppet theatres from cardboard boxes, organised neighbourhood talent shows, performed magic tricks, or staged imaginary adventures in backyards. There was little expectation that entertainment should always be purchased. Creativity itself became one of the greatest forms of amusement. Another curious habit was saving bacon grease or cooking fat in small containers for future recipes. Rather than immediately throwing it away, many homemakers stored it carefully to use later when preparing vegetables, potatoes, or other meals. This practice reflected a generation that believed useful things should rarely be wasted. Local businesses also operated with remarkable familiarity. The butcher knew exactly which cuts of meat regular customers preferred. The baker remembered favourite pastries. The pharmacist often recognized entire families by name. Shopping became a personal experience built on years of trust rather than anonymous transactions. Many children developed hobbies that connected them closely with nature. They raised caterpillars to watch them become butterflies, built bird feeders, searched for unusual wildflowers, collected colourful feathers, or identified different kinds of trees during long walks. These simple activities required nothing more than curiosity and time. Yet they created lasting memories. Another strange difference involved the amount of quiet people experienced. There were no constant notification sounds, vibrating phones, or endless streams of digital information demanding attention. Silence filled many parts of the day, broken only by familiar household. Sounds like the ticking of a clock, the whistle of a kettle, birds singing outside, or neighbors chatting across a fence. People rarely considered silence uncomfortable because it was simply part of everyday life. Families also approached rainy weekends differently. Instead of feeling disappointed by cancelled outdoor plans, many welcomed the opportunity to stay inside together. Fresh bread might bake in the oven, while parents worked on puzzles with children, listened to the radio, or shared stories from their own childhoods. Simple moments spent together often became the memories people treasured most. Another surprisingly common practice was ironing nearly everything. Shirts, dresses, tablecloths, bed linens, and even handkerchiefs were carefully pressed before use. Wrinkled clothing was generally viewed as untidy, so ironing became a regular household chore that required both patience and skill. Many neighborhoods also had local traditions known only to the people who lived there. Annual picnics, holiday decorating contests, friendly baseball games, community fairs, and seasonal celebrations helped create a strong sense of belonging. Children grew up expecting these events every year, rarely imagining that neighborhoods elsewhere might celebrate differently. Another forgotten custom involved lending books to friends with complete confidence that they would eventually be returned. Inside the front cover, many people wrote their names neatly in ink, creating personal libraries that reflected years of reading. Books often traveled through circles of friends before returning home, carrying little reminders of everyone who had enjoyed them. Perhaps most remarkable was how ordinary people accepted that some questions simply remained unanswered for a while. If someone wondered about a historical event, the name of a distant mountain, or the meaning of an unfamiliar word, they might wait until their next visit to the library or ask an older relative. Curiosity often led to conversations instead of instant searches, and learning became a slower but deeply satisfying process. As another peaceful evening settled over the neighborhood, porch lights glowed softly, radios played quietly behind open windows, and children reluctantly headed indoors after hearing their names called across the street. The day's routines had been simple, familiar, and entirely ordinary to everyone living through them. Yet, decades later, those same routines seem almost unbelievable. Not because they were dramatic, but because they reflected a world that moved at a completely different pace. The 1950s remind us that history is built just as much from everyday habits as from famous events. The little customs people barely noticed at the time, sharing one telephone, repairing old toys, borrowing from neighbors, writing letters by hand, and gathering around the dinner table every evening, have become some of the most fascinating windows into a generation whose idea of normal now feels wonderfully strange. Even the smallest moments of the day reflected a world that operated by completely different expectations. When someone wanted to wake a family member in the morning, they walked to the bedroom door and gently knocked instead of sending a message or making a phone call. If children wanted to invite friends to play, they rode their bicycles across the neighborhood. Rather than creating group chats, conversations happened naturally because people shared the same physical spaces, and relationships grew stronger through countless face-to-face interactions that filled ordinary days. Another surprisingly normal custom was carefully folding and saving paper grocery bags. Instead of throwing them away, families reused them to carry lunches, cover school textbooks, store household items, or line kitchen shelves. Nothing useful was wasted if it could serve another purpose. The same attitude applied to glass jars, sturdy boxes, pieces of string, and even old newspapers, all of which found second or third lives around the house. Many families also owned a single camera that remained tucked away for most of the year. Bringing it out usually meant that something important was happening. Weddings, graduations, birthdays, holiday dinners, and family vacations deserved photographs, while ordinary days often passed without a single picture being taken. Ironically, because so few photographs existed, each one became far more valuable than the thousands of digital images people casually take today. Another forgotten habit involved children entertaining themselves during long car journeys. Without tablets, portable game consoles, or streaming videos, they counted passing cars, searched for unusual road signs, guessed the names of distant towns, or simply stared out the window watching farms, rivers, mountains, and forests slowly pass by. These quiet hours encouraged imagination and observation, turning even a simple road trip into an adventure. People also expected neighbors to know one another's families across several generations. Grandparents, parents, and children often lived in the same community for many years, allowing friendships to develop over decades. Elderly neighbors watched children grow into adults, attended their weddings, and later welcomed the next generation. Communities carried long memories because families often stayed in one place rather than moving frequently. Another curious routine was carefully wrapping leftovers before placing them in the refrigerator. Wax paper, aluminum foil, reusable containers, and covered bowls kept food fresh for the next day's meal. Throwing away edible food was generally avoided whenever possible, and creative recipes often transformed yesterday's dinner into today's lunch. The arrival of spring also brought traditions that many neighborhoods shared. Families opened windows after long winters, aired out blankets in the sunshine, cleaned every room from top to bottom, planted flower gardens, and repaired fences damaged by cold weather. These seasonal rituals marked the changing year in ways that felt deeply satisfying because they connected daily life with nature's rhythm. Another ordinary sight was children carrying library books home in their arms after school, eager to finish one story before borrowing another. Reading remained one of the greatest sources of entertainment because books allowed people to travel to distant places through imagination alone. Local librarians often remembered young readers by name and happily recommended new adventures waiting on the shelves. Many households also displayed family portraits in prominent places. Framed wedding photographs, military service pictures, graduation portraits, and images of grandparents decorated living room walls and hallway tables. These photographs quietly reminded everyone of family history every single day, preserving memories long before digital photo albums existed. Another fascinating custom involved neighborhood celebrations during national holidays. Streets filled with homemade decorations, local marching bands, community picnics, and children waving small flags while bicycles were decorated with colorful streamers. These celebrations brought entire neighborhoods together, creating memories shared by everyone who lived nearby. People also accepted that learning practical skills took time. Sewing, woodworking, gardening, cooking, repairing bicycles, maintaining automobiles, and preserving food were all abilities developed gradually through years of practice. There was genuine satisfaction in mastering these skills because they made everyday life easier and often saved valuable money. Perhaps one of the most remarkable differences was the absence of constant urgency. Most people were not rushing to answer messages within seconds or worrying about endless notifications demanding attention. When the day's work was finished, it was often truly finished. Evenings belonged to family, neighbors, hobbies, or quiet relaxation. There was a clearer separation between work and personal life that many people today find difficult to imagine. As another peaceful night settled over countless towns and neighborhoods, porch lights dimmed, radios fell silent, clocks continued their steady ticking, and families drifted off to sleep, ready to repeat many of the same familiar routines the following morning. To the people living through the 1950s, these habits seemed perfectly ordinary. They never imagined that future generations would find something as simple as sharing one telephone, memorizing directions, writing letters by hand, repairing worn-out clothing, or spending entire afternoons outdoors so incredibly unusual. Yet these small customs now serve as fascinating reminders of how quickly everyday life can change. The 1950s were filled with strange things that felt completely normal at the time, proving that the ordinary moments people rarely think about often become the most extraordinary windows into the past. As another week quietly passed in the 1950s, families settled into routines that felt so familiar they hardly noticed them. Monday meant returning to work and school. Saturday often became the day for errands and household chores, and Sunday was reserved for family gatherings, church services for many communities, or relaxing together after a busy week. These routines rarely changed, and that predictability brought a comforting rhythm to everyday life. There was no constant pressure to fill every free moment with new experiences, because familiar routines were considered part of a happy life. Another everyday custom that now seems unusual was the careful treatment of family furniture. Children were often reminded not to jump on sofas, drag chairs across wooden floors, or place drinks directly on polished tables without using coasters. Many households owned furniture that parents expected would remain in the family for decades. Every scratch or stain mattered because replacing expensive items was not something most families planned to do anytime soon. Many people also kept small household toolboxes filled with basic items like screwdrivers, nails, pliers, hammers, measuring tape, and spare screws. Instead of immediately calling someone to fix a loose cabinet door or squeaky hinge, many homeowners attempted the repair themselves. Practical knowledge was part of everyday adulthood, and children often watched these repairs with curiosity, slowly learning useful skills through observation. Another forgotten habit involved collecting rainwater in barrels placed beneath roof gutters. This water was commonly used for watering gardens, washing outdoor tools, or other household tasks where drinking water was unnecessary. Making good use of available resources simply seemed like common sense, especially for families who remembered earlier decades when every resource mattered. The local grocery store also offered a very different shopping experience. Employees often knew customers personally and sometimes remembered exactly which products each family usually purchased. If a favorite item had not arrived that week, the shopkeeper might apologize personally and promise to set one aside when the next delivery came. Shopping felt less like a transaction and more like visiting familiar members of the community. Another fascinating routine involved seasonal wardrobes. Instead of wearing similar clothing throughout the year, families carefully packed away winter coats, wool blankets, heavy sweaters and boots. Once warmer weather arrived, summer clothing then appeared from carefully stored boxes, marking the changing seasons in a very physical way. Opening those boxes each year became a familiar ritual that signaled a new chapter of the year. Children also spent surprising amounts of time simply watching the world around them. They observed construction crews building new homes, trains passing through town, birds building nests in spring, or neighbors working in their gardens. Entertainment often came from paying close attention to ordinary life rather than constantly searching for something new. Another everyday custom involved handwritten recipes being passed between friends. If someone served an especially delicious pie, casserole, or cake, guests frequently asked for the recipe before going home. Instead of sending a photograph or internet link, the recipe was carefully copied by hand onto a small card, often including personal tips that had been learned through years of experience. Many families also treasured simple evening walks. After dinner, parents and children sometimes strolled slowly through the neighborhood, greeting familiar faces sitting on porches or tending flower gardens. These walks required no destination at all. The purpose was simply to enjoy fresh air, stretch after dinner, and spend quiet time together before bedtime. Another curious difference involved household sounds during laundry day. Even the smallest moments of the day reflected a world that operated by completely different expectations. When someone wanted to wake a family member in the morning, they walked to the bedroom door and gently knocked instead of sending a message or making a phone call. If children wanted to invite friends to play, they rode their bicycles across the neighborhood. Rather than creating group chats, conversations happened naturally because people shared the same physical spaces, and relationships grew stronger through countless face-to-face interactions that filled ordinary days. Another surprisingly normal custom was carefully folding and saving paper grocery bags. Instead of throwing them away, families reused them to carry lunches, cover school textbooks, store household items, or line kitchen shelves. Nothing useful was wasted if it could serve another purpose. The same attitude applied to glass jars, sturdy boxes, pieces of string, and even old newspapers, all of which found second or third lives around the house. Many families also owned a single camera that remained tucked away for most of the year. Bringing it out usually meant that something important was happening. Weddings, graduations, birthdays, holiday dinners, and family vacations deserved photographs, while ordinary days often passed without a single picture being taken. Ironically, because so few photographs existed, each one became far more valuable than the thousands of digital images people casually take today. Another forgotten habit involved children entertaining themselves during long car journeys. Without tablets, portable game consoles, or streaming videos, they counted passing cars, searched for unusual road signs, guessed the names of distant towns, or simply stared out the window watching farms, rivers, mountains, and forests slowly pass by. These quiet hours encouraged imagination and observation, turning even a simple road trip into an adventure. People also expected neighbors to know one another's families across several generations. Grandparents, parents, and children often lived in the same community for many years, allowing friendships to develop over decades. Elderly neighbors watched children grow into adults, attended their weddings, and later welcomed the next generation. Communities carried long memories because families often stayed in one place rather than moving frequently. Another curious routine was carefully wrapping leftovers before placing them in the refrigerator. Wax paper, aluminum foil, reusable containers, and covered bowls kept food fresh for the next day's meal. Throwing away edible food was generally avoided whenever possible, and creative recipes often transformed yesterday's dinner into today's lunch. The arrival of spring also brought traditions that many neighborhoods shared. Families opened windows after long winters, aired out blankets in the sunshine, cleaned every room from top to bottom, planted flower gardens, and repaired fences damaged by cold weather. These seasonal rituals marked the changing year in ways that felt deeply satisfying because they connected daily life with nature's rhythm. Another ordinary sight was children carrying library books home in their arms after school, eager to finish one story before borrowing another. Reading remained one of the greatest sources of entertainment because books allowed people to travel to distant places through imagination alone. Local librarians often remembered young readers by name and happily recommended new adventures waiting on the shelves. Many households also displayed family portraits in prominent places, framed wedding photographs, military service pictures, graduation portraits, and images of grandparents decorated living room walls and hallway tables. These photographs quietly reminded everyone of family history every single day, preserving memories long before digital photo albums existed. Another fascinating custom involved neighborhood celebrations during national holidays. Streets filled with homemade decorations, local marching bands, community picnics, and children waving small flags while bicycles were decorated with colorful streamers. These celebrations brought entire neighborhoods together, creating memories shared by everyone who lived nearby. People also accepted that learning practical skills took time. Sewing, woodworking, gardening, cooking, repairing bicycles, maintaining automobiles, and preserving food were all abilities developed gradually through years of practice. There was genuine satisfaction in mastering these skills because they made everyday life easier and often saved valuable money. Perhaps one of the most remarkable differences was the absence of constant urgency. Most people were not rushing to answer messages within seconds or worrying about endless notifications demanding attention. When the day's work was finished, it was often truly finished. Evenings belonged to family, neighbors, hobbies, or quiet relaxation. There was a clearer separation between work and personal life that many people today find difficult to imagine. As another peaceful night settled over countless towns and neighborhoods, porch lights dimmed, radios fell silent, clocks continued their steady ticking, and families drifted off to sleep, ready to repeat many of the same familiar routines the following morning. To the people living through the 1950s, these habits seemed perfectly ordinary. They never imagined that future generations would find something as simple as sharing one telephone, memorizing directions, writing letters by hand, repairing worn-out clothing, or spending entire afternoons outdoors so incredibly unusual. Yet these small customs now serve as fascinating reminders of how quickly everyday life can change. The 1950s were filled with strange things that felt completely normal at the time, proving that the ordinary moments people rarely think about often become the most extraordinary windows into the past. As another week quietly passed in the 1950s, families settled into routines that felt so familiar they hardly noticed them. Monday meant returning to work and school. Saturday often became the day for errands and household chores, and Sunday was reserved for family gatherings, church services for many communities, or relaxing together after a busy week. These routines rarely changed, and that predictability brought a comforting rhythm to everyday life. There was no constant pressure to fill every free moment with new experiences, because familiar routines were considered part of a happy life. Another everyday custom that now seems unusual was the careful treatment of family furniture. Children were often reminded not to jump on sofas, drag chairs across wooden floors, or place drinks directly on polished tables without using coasters. Many households owned furniture that parents expected would remain in the family for decades. Every scratch or stain mattered because replacing expensive items was not something most families planned to do anytime soon. Many people also kept small household toolboxes filled with basic items like screwdrivers, nails, pliers, hammers, measuring tape, and spare screws. Instead of immediately calling someone to fix a loose cabinet door or squeaky hinge, many homeowners attempted the repair themselves. Practical knowledge was part of everyday adulthood, and children often watched these repairs with curiosity, slowly learning useful skills through observation. Another forgotten habit involved collecting rainwater in barrels placed beneath roof gutters. This water was commonly used for watering gardens, washing outdoor tools, or other household tasks where drinking water was unnecessary. Making good use of available resources simply seemed like common sense, especially for families who remembered earlier decades when every resource mattered. The local grocery store also offered a very different shopping experience. Employees often knew customers personally and sometimes remembered exactly which products each family usually purchased. If a favorite item had not arrived that week, the shopkeeper might apologize personally and promise to set one aside when the next delivery came. Shopping felt less like a transaction and more like visiting familiar members of the community. Another fascinating routine involved seasonal wardrobes. Instead of wearing similar clothing throughout the year, families carefully packed away winter coats, wool blankets, heavy sweaters and boots. Once warmer weather arrived, summer clothing then appeared from carefully stored boxes, marking the changing seasons in a very physical way. Opening those boxes each year became a familiar ritual that signaled a new chapter of the year. Children also spent surprising amounts of time simply watching the world around them. They observed construction crews building new homes, trains passing through town, birds building nests in spring, or neighbors working in their gardens. Entertainment often came from paying close attention to ordinary life, rather than constantly searching for something new. Another everyday custom involved handwritten recipes being passed between friends. If someone served an especially delicious pie, casserole, or cake, guests frequently asked for the recipe before going home. Instead of sending a photograph or internet link, the recipe was carefully copied by hand onto a small card, often including personal tips that had been learned through years of experience. Many families also treasured simple evening walks. After dinner, parents and children sometimes strolled slowly through the neighborhood, greeting familiar faces sitting on porches or tending flower gardens. These walks required no destination at all. The purpose was simply to enjoy fresh air, stretch after dinner, and spend quiet time together before bedtime. Another curious difference involved household sounds during laundry day.